other people are trickling in and you see them wondering where to find some information, you get tasked with handing them sheets of paper as they walk in. That's the reward for sitting next to the door. Just a little bit of background about Etcetera for those of you who are new to this meeting. This was started about 1.5 years ago just as an opportunity to get people together and talk about some of the bigger questions in life, whether it's cultural issues or philosophy or theology or ethics. And we try to bring people in from a variety of opinions. One of the goals we have in terms of the panel of speakers is that we try to represent a broad range. We want people to speak boldly about their position. And the goal is just to get a lot of information out, and as you're here to kind of absorb what everybody's saying, to think through the different topics. And about halfway through the evening, typically around 8 o'clock, we will open it up for questions from the audience. So as you hear all the discussion going on amongst the panel members, be writing questions down. You could actually be posting questions on our Facebook page if you wanted to visit it, which I think is listed at the bottom of the sheet of paper. It is. So you can post questions on there. You will see questions posted on there also by some of the other people involved with Etcetera. So if you go home tonight or this next week, you're looking for something to do online, check out our Facebook page. You'll see quotes from the different people who were speaking or some of the questions from the audience we put on Facebook, and you can keep the conversation going there as well. This building is owned by Good Work Collective, and Beth, if I say anything incorrectly or you want to add something, feel free to. Am I right? The building
Porterhouse Productions.
Porterhouse Productions. Good Work Collective is owned by Porterhouse Productions, and they are letting us use this space as just community gathering spot. So, do you know, Beth, is there something back there for people to contribute money?
Yeah, I think that glass pitcher that's on the counter could work for that. It's fine.
I'll have to empty it of water first.
Oh, it does. But I'll find something to put it by the door.
There'll be something here, or a jar where if you'd like to contribute some money, it just goes right to Porterhouse Productions for the use of the facility. So that would be cool to do. Normally, I have it worked out that there's coffee here. That did not happen this week. I have no excuses. So it'll be sure we're up again next month. We tried to heat the room up before we started so we could turn the fan off so it's easier for you to hear. If some of you in the back, if we begin to see your breath, we will turn the fan back on, but if we can get by without the noise, it will be a little more pleasant. After the discussion is done, we will be moving over to Blue Tractor like we always do. We encourage you, if you want to sit around and just talk with people for another hour or 2 or 3, however long they let us there, we continue the conversation at that point. So, final comments. You see bios on the sheet of the different people involved tonight with the panelists. Kim is our moderator, and I think Kim's information is on there as well. And I'm just going to say a little bit more, and then Kim's going to take it away. Back in January, Kim was hosting a show for Up North Live called Crosstalks, and the topic of one of them had to do with the presence of religious symbols in the public square. And there was a panel of, was it 6 of us at the time? And we thought it might be a cool idea to try to replicate something like that. So, Kim, take it away.
Before I get started too, we're taping this evening, so just to be aware of that, if anybody has an issue and doesn't want to be taped, I think it's we're not streaming live, but nope. It'll be put up on the website at a future date. And at future meetings, we may be taping to put this on the public access television station, so we're kind of excited about that and wondered if you all thought that was can we take a quickie?
Let's take it at the end so I have time to think about it.
Okay. Anyway, ponder that. But anyway, okay, so our topic this evening is religion necessary for ethics? And this did stem from a show that I hosted, which was a panel. We talked about the role of religion in the public square. And of course, the conversation continued after the program, especially with Anthony and me and Scott and some others. And we decided that we wanted to take that conversation farther. And when we arrived at the idea, is religion necessary for ethics, we kind of all agreed that the answer was no, and that was the end of the conversation. So we decided that there is something there, though, to talk in a broader scope about what does that mean and what are the ramifications and all of that. So this evening, the 4 guests will each have an opportunity to talk and kind of give their point of view for 5 to 10 minutes. And then after they're each individually finished, then I will kind of promote a conversation among them, and we'll go from there. Then we'll open it up to questions. So to my left is Scott Blair. He is a humanist and represents that point of view. To my immediate left is Harry Dorman. He's a Wiccan priest and minister. You've met Anthony to my right. He's a Christian pastor as well as many others, a very long list of multiple titles, if you will, and things that he's involved with. And to my far right is Chris Lawrence. He is a philosophy instructor. So, Chris, you've been elected to go first to give your spiel. Is religion necessary for ethics?
All right, so the question is actually a very broad question, and like a lot of questions in English, it's ambiguous. There are lots of different ways to interpret that question. So I'm going to try to respond to maybe a narrower question that I can get a handle on. So are there true religious, or are there true moral principles that we can live by that don't depend on the truth of any particularly religious claims? Okay. And I think we can make some progress toward answering that by looking at research that's been done to some extent in psychology, but largely in philosophy. So I want to begin just by talking about some research that was done by Lawrence Kohlberg, who argued that there are various stages of moral or ethical reasoning that we can go through. And he did this by asking children questions about certain moral dilemmas. And of course, older people as well, sort of comparing how they answered those questions. So for example, he might pose a moral dilemma like, suppose a woman is sick and it turns out that she needs a certain medication in order to get better. But it turns out that medication she cannot afford. Okay, so in this situation, she's bedridden, she's probably going to die soon if she doesn't get that medication, but she's married, and in this example, she's married to a man. I don't know if that's still an issue that people are talking about, but in this case, her husband has to make a decision about whether to steal that medication or not steal it, and thus let her die. Okay. So it's a thought experiment. For a practical situation. We would probably be able to think of lots of other types of ways to resolve this issue, right? But it's a thought experiment, so you have to choose one of those two answers, and then say why you would choose that answer. Okay. Now, it turned out he didn't care what sort of answer any of the respondents gave. What he was interested in is what they used to justify that answer. Okay. So how do they explain why this, as opposed to that, was the right thing to do? Okay. So some of the youngest students he asked responded in terms of whether I would get punished for doing one thing or the other. Okay, so at very early stage of ethical reasoning, people are concerned primarily about obeying authority and avoiding punishment. Okay. Now, if you have kids or know kids, you probably know that rings true, right? But we also probably know some adults who are at that stage as well. Okay, so progression through these stages is not inevitable. Okay? In some religious traditions, that's the sort of reasoning that's going on. Right? If you don't do this, you're going to be punished forever in hell, for example. Right? Turn or burn type stuff. Okay. At the second stage, they broaden that circle a little bit and realize, okay, there are multiple authorities, and it evokes a kind of relativism where people are concerned about, well, in this situation, I have to be concerned about being punished by this authority. In this situation, you have to be concerned about being punished by this authority. At a third stage, you broaden the circle even more, and you start thinking about, I should be working toward helping those people who are, say, my friends, looking out for them, promoting harmonious sort of sub-communities. Fourth stage, you broaden the circle even more, and what we're concerned about is bigger groups, like whole cities or states or nations. Okay? And the reasoning behind whether a certain action is right or wrong at that stage has to do with whether it promotes law and order. At the fifth stage, you broaden the circle even more. You start thinking about things like, what is the, not necessarily what's going on in my society, but what's the ideal society like? By what principles should we come up with the rules by which an ideal society should live? And then at the sixth stage, you get to the level of universal moral principles. Okay. So a sort of easy way to remember or to think about these stages is in terms of their relation to certain social conventions. Okay, so the first two stages would be pre-conventional. What I'm concerned about with respect to whether a certain action is right is, how is it going to affect me, right? I might not even be aware that there's a whole society out there with various rules that they have. Right? In the middle stages, you're worried about certain conventions. You're worried about you're broadening the circle. You're thinking, how's it gonna affect us, but not them. Who cares about them, right? It's us. It's a broader circle, but it's not a complete circle. And at the post-conventional stage, we're concerned about everybody. You open up the circle as far as it can go. Okay. So what I want to do now is sort of talk about some ethical theories, some attempts to answer the question, what makes an action right? And one of them will be a theory that suggests that morality does depend on religion. And then I'll describe briefly a couple of other theories according to which morality does not. And these other theories also lend themselves to reasoning at the highest level of moral reasoning in terms of universal moral principles. Okay. So a very popular theory among people who think that morality has to be grounded in religion is the divine command theory. It's popular in some sense. It's not very popular among people who've studied it. Most Christian philosophers think that this theory is not true. But a lot of people who consider themselves Christian or theist do in some sense rely on this theory. So the theory says that an action is right just in case it is commanded by God, or willed by God, or approved of by God. There are different versions of it. Right? Let me just talk about some of the problems with this theory. So an initial problem, maybe that comes up is, well, it might raise a red flag because it's an authoritarian style of theory. It suggests that whether an action is right or wrong ultimately depends on what some authority says. Okay? And that sort of authoritative reasoning can be a low-level type of moral reasoning. Reasoning in terms of, will I be punished or rewarded? Okay? It doesn't have to be, but it can be. So that's a potential issue. A more serious issue has to do with what philosophers call a workability problem. Okay? One thing we want out of a moral theory, a theory that tells us how we should or shouldn't act, is that it can be applied to particular situations. But one problem that comes up is, well, which God should I be listening to, right? I mean, throughout human history, there have been hundreds of gods that people have believed in, and it turns out they don't necessarily agree about what we ought to be doing, right? So that's a potential workability problem. Even if we narrow it down to, say, the traditional Christian God, that doesn't necessarily solve the problem because, well, there are hundreds of Christian denominations that have split off because, in part, they disagree about what it is God wants us to do, right? And even within the Bible itself, we see lots of different voices suggesting that God wants us to do this, and then in a different passage, God saying, no, don't do that, that's terrible, right? Or people speaking on God's behalf, for example. Okay, so that's the second, maybe a major problem. The most famous problem, sort of, for this type of theory in the history of philosophy is the Euthyphro dilemma. It goes back to Plato, like 500 years or so before Jesus. So the problem suggests that there's a dilemma for this type of theory that says an action is right just in case God commands it. Okay? And the question is, well, is the action right because God commands it, or does God command that action because it is right? Okay. Now, each of these questions suggests a different relation between God and morality, right? if an action is right because God commands it, the picture that presents is that God is sort of looking at a list of all the possible actions and sort of saying yes, no, no, yes, no, right? I'll allow it, but you better be going somewhere with this counselor type thing, right? But what would that say about morality? It suggests, doesn't necessarily entail, but suggests that morality is sort of arbitrary, right? It's just whatever God happened to command turned out to be right, and whatever he happened to forbid was wrong. So it's kind of an accident or a coincidence that, you know, giving to charity is right and torturing children is wrong. Like, it could have just been the other way around if God commanded something else. A lot of people, including me, find that a little disturbing and not in line with what I think it means to be a moral person or to act morally. Okay? That it's not that arbitrary. There's something more systematic about it. If you take the other horn of the dilemma, that God commands an action because it's right, well, that suggests a picture according to which God is sort of figuring out which actions are right and then saying, okay, do those things, right? And I figured out which actions are wrong and don't do those things. Okay. Well, in that picture, God is sort of a benevolent dictator in a sense, right? He's and maybe omniscient dictator, right? He knows what the right things are and he's telling us to do them. He's sort of trying to help us out. But what it suggests is that what makes the action right isn't God's commanding it, it's something else, right? So God is deciding on the basis of some further features what makes those actions right. So that suggests that some other moral theory must be doing the actual work. There's some other feature of those actions that makes them right, and God is deciding, so to speak, on that basis to command those actions. Okay. All right. There are many responses to that sort of objection to the divine command theory, and then replies to that. I'll skip over those, and if people want to ask about them, I can talk about them more later. But now I want to talk about some theories that I think are a little bit more plausible, that that give us a way to reason about ethics or morality at a higher level using universal moral principles. So one of them, I'll pick a couple of famous ones, is the categorical imperative. This is a theory endorsed by Immanuel Kant. It's a deontological theory. It has to do with rights and duties. According to this theory, an action is right if it's done on the basis of a principled attention that meets a couple of important criteria. So one of the criteria is that the action is reversible, or the principled intention is reversible. And the other is that it be universalizable. So when you're going to do something, you have to think about the principle on which you're acting. What is my intention here, perfectly generalized? Okay, so the reversibility part says, would I be okay with someone acting on that principle with respect to me? Or more generally, would I be okay with everybody acting on that principle? Right? And so that probably sounds familiar. It sounds a lot like the golden rule, except it's not just do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's do unto others as you would have all of them do unto everybody. Right? So it's a little broader. The universalizability criteria suggests that the principle on which you act should be something that can be consistently applied by everyone. Okay? And what he's trying to avoid, Kant thinks morality is dependent on rationality and reason, on logic. Okay? What he's trying to avoid is that our acting on principles that are sort of self-undermining. So, for example, if I wanted to, suppose I'm short of cash and I want to borrow some money, I think, well, a person's more likely to lend me money if I tell them I'm going to pay it back. Okay? But if I do that, knowing full well I have no intention of paying back, if I'm borrowing money on the basis of a false promise, well, think about what would happen if everybody were to act on that principle. Well, soon people would be very skittish about lending out money, right? And eventually they would just stop lending out money, which means that it would be impossible to borrow money, which means it would be impossible to borrow money on the basis of a false promise. So if everybody acted according to this principle that I was acting on, it would soon become impossible to act on that principle. So in that sense, the principle sort of undermines itself. Kant would say that's a reason to think that that action is immoral. And then finally, let me just say a little bit about utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a consequentialist theory. It says that whether an action is right or wrong depends on what happens as a result of your doing it in that situation. Again, according to this theory, each person is equal. None of that tribal, in-group, out-group stuff applies. Everybody's happiness or unhappiness counts the same. According to this theory, whether an action is right depends on whether it maximizes happiness. And happiness is sort of broadly construed. You know, it's not as if like the ideal moral behavior is to try to get everybody high or something like that. There's a deeper sort of happiness I think that he has, that utilitarians have in mind, something lasting and substantial. And so to apply this sort of utilitarian theory, essentially what you do is when you're acting, you think about what the alternatives are in that situation. And for each of the alternatives, you try to think about, well, if I did that, who would be affected? How much happiness or unhappiness would it bring to each of the people affected? And then you use sort of hedonistic calculus and figure out which of those actions is the one that would produce the most net happiness or produce the least unhappiness. And you know, one of the, I guess in practice, one of the corollaries or one of the principles that comes out of that sort of view is that we should try to make other people happy, and we should try to avoid causing unnecessary suffering. So, yeah, I think there are some principles, moral principles we can live by that don't depend necessarily on any religious claims being true. And I mean, some of the best candidates are these consequentialist and deontological theories. If you put those together, a majority of philosophers actually think something in there is right, and it's sort of rare to get that much consensus in philosophy. So I think those theories are at least a good basis for working toward a true moral theory.
Thanks, Chris.
Yep.
I'm going to go to Anthony next, but before I do, Carrie, he was giving you the wave because I think he's run out of ink in his pen, and he's feeling really desperate to
I was going to trade pens with you without telling you that
have
I
an
was
ink
out
pen,
of
so let's run and do that right away. Move on. We're all trying to take notes so we can have a conversation.
How many do you need? I got it.
So, now that you feel more...
I'm way behind now, though, because I was
Let's
kind of right
not You're stealing mine. So, Anthony, you're up. What's your take?
All right, I'm going to take just a little bit of a different focus than Chris did. Chris was talking a lot about kind of the development of individual moral theory. I'm going to broaden out just a little bit and talk about, as we're looking at groups of people, how we're trying to arrive at conclusions about how to do right, how to live well. And there's a lot of them. I'm going to focus on four. One is natural law theory. The second is legal positivism or legal realism. The third one is the categorical imperative. And the fourth one is, I'll call it divine fiat or divine command. I'll go ahead and use Chris's term for that. So natural law theories, it starts with Aquinas, or Aristotle, I should say. Aquinas was a proponent of it. You see it pop up in the French Revolution with the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and you see it pop up in our country's founding documents. And the idea is that there is some type of order within the world that it's accessible to everyone. It's kind of the nature of reality. There are things that are right, there are things that are wrong. And through studying, not through studying the way nature works through science necessarily, but it's just embedded principles in the world that everybody has access to and that everybody can agree upon. Now, you can come at it from different perspectives. Obviously, the French Revolution, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, was coming at it from an atheistic perspective. The founding documents for America was coming at it from a deistic perspective or a theistic perspective. They would have agreed that there was something within the world that was present, that was accessible. Legal positivism or legal realism is more of a recent development, and I am not I'm not a scholar on legal theory, so I'm kind of representing what I have read in the common literature for folks like me. But legal realism is more the idea that there's not something in place in reality that's objective or unchanging, and that the standards by which cultures live are decided by the people in charge. So those who are in authority, be it a king or be it a senate, they make rules, and the authoritative nature of these rules comes from the fact that someone has power and can enforce it. So natural law says there's something objective in place that kind of underlies everything about reality. Legal realism or legal positivism says that doesn't exist, but we as cultures can put something in place that will carry with it some kind of force for the people who live in a particular area. As Chris pointed out, Kant's categorical imperative has been a very accessible one because it builds on a lot of ideas that are present through a lot of world history. It's the golden rule writ large. This idea that if I can always act like I would like everyone else to act all the time, that'll be a pretty good way for me to gauge whether or not what I'm doing is a good idea. Then finally, the idea of divine command, that there is something about reality that transcends just the physical world or just what we experience here, but there is a divine force or a divine authority that underlies the things that we believe that we ought to do. And with all of these, I'm going to go through some questions that can be asked of all four of them. But in all of those positions, divine command, you obviously start from a religious base. With the other ones, you may or may not. And of course, in answer to one of our original questions, can people be ethical without God? Sure. I don't think any of us are debating that. There's different ways that people arrive at those conclusions. I'm going to ask two other questions as part of my opening presentation here, and that is, if we can agree that everyone can exercise ethical decisions, can make ethical decisions, can live ethical lives, everyone can do it pulling from different places. The question isn't so much, can people be ethical based on a particular worldview? I think there's two deeper questions. The next question would be, what is the motivation that people have to do the thing that they believe is ethical? So we can talk a lot about the different ways in which we as cultures or even we as individuals arrive at what we believe is the right thing to do. But I think a deeper question is, why should we? How do we get an oughtness into the discussion? Because all the ways that Chris mentioned and the things I've mentioned now are ways to at least achieve a consensus on what an orderly society looks like, and kind of, if nothing else, a minimal standard of how we can stop from going into anarchy. But of course, I would guess all of us in this room have experienced in life that there's many times we're in situations where there's something we think we really should do, like it's the right thing to do, but there's this tremendous urge not to do that thing, and often we choose not to. And that's not just as individuals, but throughout world history, I think you can see entire cultures do that at times, where they embrace particular things that are devastating. And take, for example, a lot of the fighting in Rwanda. A lot of people can look at that from the outside and go, there's something that's going wrong here, but somehow within a whole, at least particular segment of society, something is happening that even if there's a sense that we ought not be doing this to our neighbors, we often do the things that we don't think we should do. So the second question that I ask after can we be ethical is, why ought we be ethical? Where does the force come from? Is it from just fear, for example, of government or being jailed, or from being ostracized by the community? What brings weight to the idea that we need to choose well? I was reading a debate that Peter Singer did with John Hare at MIT a couple years ago, and they were discussing ethics, which is always interesting when you get Singer and John Hare together. And Singer pointed out that he believes in things like sharing and reciprocity and fairness, and he said he thinks those are very crucial things to do. And he had his reasons that he arrived at that point. But he said an interesting thing, and I quote, he said, "That's not to say that they are therefore right. We may decide to live ethically because we want to and because we will feel better, but I can't give a more definite answer than that." And that's one that, coming at this from a Christian perspective, from a religious perspective, it makes me think of the question, what do I do when there's things I believe I ought to do? Is it simply because I'll feel better, or because I want to, or is there a way in which there's something beyond me that lends some moral force that urges me to get beyond the parts of me that don't want to do what I know I should do and do it anyway? So I think motivation is an interesting thing to talk about with ethics. And then finally, I think a question of a foundational point. What is the thing that grounds the particular system by which we are discerning ethics? So let's take natural law. Natural law, and I apologize if my paraphrase of what natural law is, Butcher's natural law. When it comes to Q&A, you can correct me if I'm not representing it accurately. But the idea that we all experience something about the world that leads us to conclusions about how we ought to live well. One of the difficulties with this is that conscience, an individual conscience and a moral perspective can be very much conditioned by culture. And so even by referencing natural law, you can go different places in the world where different cultures will say we have built up a particular ethical system through natural law, but you reach very different conclusions. And I'll give you one example. The Justinian Code was written in the 6th century, and they defined natural law this way: to live honestly, to harm no one, and to make sure each one has what he deserves. Which sounds good to me. To live honestly, to harm no one, to make sure each one has what he deserves. But 14 centuries later, Hitler hung a sign, playing the Holocaust card. Hitler hung a sign over the camp at Buchenwald, which you can still see today, in which he quotes the last phrase from the Justinian Code: each person gets what he properly deserves. So you've got two different people, 14 centuries apart, using the same phrase to define something about why they've chosen to do a particular thing. And so while I think it's a great discussion to have about are there principles embedded in the world, we see as we go to different cultures and different places, people use the same language and reach very different conclusions. The categorical imperative, I think, is a fantastic way to think through ethical dilemmas. One of the difficulties that does arise is that there are outliers. There are people for whom particular things, they would be thrilled if all of the world would act in a particular way. And sorry, I'm going to play the Holocaust card again. It's such an easy one to play. Hitler, for example, if you would say to him, you ought not value this Aryan supremacy, I think Hitler would say, well, I think everyone should value Aryan supremacy. I think everyone should be for purity of the races, just like I am. And if someone would say, do you want your principle to be enacted universally, I think you would probably agree. And that's one of the difficulties with the categorical imperative, which, as good as a tool as it is to think through ideas, what do you do with the person or the group that is perfectly happy with something that most of us would perceive as really a bad idea, and they're okay with it? How do you adjudicate between those kinds of differences? A guy named Sidgwick was one of the big names in developing utilitarianism, as was John Stuart Mill. And both of these guys, as they were talking about the idea of how do you create something with the greatest good or the greatest happiness, there's different ways, and Chris talked about this a little bit. Sidgwick said he actually saw two possibilities that would give the conclusions of utilitarianism some type of moral force in people's lives. One was the community, that you had a strong community that surrounded people who were still struggling to do the right thing. And his other conclusion, or his other option, was God. And Sidgwick was not suggesting that God was there to do with force. But my understanding is that he and Mill both said those seem to be the only two options. And if you have a community that cannot bear that kind of weight, the other thing that they saw as giving it a weight was something that had to do with God. And they didn't specify that as far as I'm aware. This was more of a concept and an idea to them than a specific thing. For the idea of positive law or legal realism, the idea that as we as cultures decide, it's just the government's force that gives weight to our moral decisions. It's a pretty good way to analyze laws within a system, like coherence theory, I guess, of whether or not something works. As you're developing new laws, you're seeing if they coincide with what you've already established to be good. Where you have difficulty is what you do when you have different nations with different laws. And in some cases, they conflict very much. What do you do to decide whose is the better system or whose system ought to carry a little more weight? If I can reference the Nuremberg trials again, I have a whole deck of Hitler cards. One of the difficulties they ran into was that for a lot of the prison guards, they were very resistant to the idea that their culture ought to be judged. We did what was right in our culture's eyes. We were good. We were good Germans at the time. And the court had to wrestle with that and find a way to prosecute from a place that transcended an individual country's decisions about what was moral and ethical. Otherwise, they were stuck. They were left with other countries' prosecutors prosecuting German citizens who said, we did nothing wrong because this was our group's consensus. And I'm not aware that the conclusion of the courts at the time were very specific, other than they used the language occasionally that there is something that transcends a country or a culture that has to carry some weight to keep particular things in check. As for divine command, I think Chris pointed out a key question for that, and that is, what do you do then when you have religious groups all over the world who are suggesting that God says different things? And I acknowledge this as a Christian. That's problematic when everybody's claiming to speak for God. So how do you discern what to do with that? My concluding statement would be, I like the idea that C.S. Lewis wrote about, and that was this idea that there's a principle he called the Tao that is shared throughout most human cultures, throughout most of history. There's general principles that no matter where people came from, they agreed upon these things. It was, for example, kindness and charity, what he called beneficence, duty to family, justice, good faith, veracity, and magnanimity, which is not a word you hear used often, but carried with it the idea of courage and nobility and generosity. And Lewis said, as he looked at history, he saw people from all different perspectives agreeing that there's particular principles that have to be in place in terms of things that carry moral weight in our lives. Now, Lewis would say he believes God placed them in the world and made them accessible to everybody. It would be a form of kind of natural law that he would say that everyone has access to. And for that reason, we can find ways, in spite of differences of opinion, to find agreement about what constitutes morality. And I think on that note, I'm probably done.
Yeah, good. So, moving on. Scott, let's hear from you next.
Okay. Well, I took the topic on a societal level. And, you know, is religion necessary for an ethical society? And religion certainly has had a role in cementing ethical systems into culture through history, but, you know, is that right or useful? Well, those who believe in a God that is a creator and that watches over humanity and that has moral prescriptions for humanity would perhaps believe so, that religion is necessary. I, as a humanist and atheist, obviously, or predictably, assert that we do not. I also think, though, that many theists can acknowledge that we needn't and shouldn't rely on religion as a basis for a society's ethics. So in my little preamble here, I'm going to hit those 2 points. For a humanist, atheist perspective, where do morals come from? Where does ethics come from? And then why do I think theists also should acknowledge that we need and shouldn't rely on religion for a society's ethics? So where do ethics come from? I suggest they come from human nature, human choice, and the application of reason. We as people, we are animals. We are a product of and a part of nature. And we have a brain with some wiring and chemistry, so to speak, that is a result of natural processes, of evolution, of natural selection. And that brain that nature has endowed us with is prone to certain feelings and behaviors. Among those are empathy, reciprocity, fairness, a compulsion for fairness, altruism. This isn't our entire nature, but it's in our nature, it's part of our nature. And it's the biological basis for ethics. If you can picture humankind in our formative years as a species, small groups of proto-humans, closely genetically related, trying to make their way in the world, and to the degree that they had tendencies to care about each other and support each other and share with each other, they were likely to be more successful. And therefore, the brains that sort of fostered those emotions and behaviors were acted on by natural selection and were perpetuated and well represented in future generations. So there's a biological basis for ethics in our human nature. Now, you may hear that and say, well, that's a pretty calculating, dispassionate, outside sort of look at a very deeply human matter of emotion and behavior. And yes, it is. But we, of the humanist, rationalist perspective, also fully recognize that there's an entirely different way to experience that, and that is from the inside as a fully feeling human being. And that ethical nature expressed in my being, as I feel it, causes me to want to build and be part of a functional, honest, caring, safe, and just society. I want that. I desire that. And that's a real human fact that I experience. I want to build and be part of a society with as many opportunities as possible for joy and discovery and minimal occasions for suffering. Now, as with all things that are human, I don't think that understanding the natural origins and explanations of a thing, they don't diminish it. The reality of it as a deep human experience. I mean, they can be both. You can correctly view this from the dispassionate perspective of like a cosmic anthropologist, or you can experience as a human being, as you can with all emotions, like romantic love or anything we're equipped to feel. So they could be looked at in those two ways. And then we need to apply reason to the problem of ethical reasoning. Even in the name. We need reason to understand the consequences of our actions. And I think this is often under-recognized. I think it's probably often most of the work in making ethical choices is simply the straightforward analysis to understand what the reality of the situation is. What is the impact of my actions? When people are applying rules or standards or universally applied systems as might sometimes come from religion, they're often ill-fit or inadequate. Ill-fit in the sense that the ethical decisions are very often, if not always to some degree, situational. It's been touched on a little bit here tonight, but to take the trite, accessible example, wouldn't we all agree there are times when it's appropriate to lie? I mean, when a dangerous, murderous, creepy person wants to know where you hid your children. I mean, I think we'll all acknowledge it. And then inadequate, the application of universal standards, it can be inadequate in the sense that You know, perhaps a person is living out the ethics as they understand them from their religion all their life. They believe they're doing it right, but they're oblivious to some of the effects or impacts of their actions. Maybe they're living what they think is a fully ethical life, but they're part of or perpetuating some economic injustice, or maybe they're incognizant of sustainability issues and therefore are impacting future generations. In other words, the prescriptive approach may be inadequate as well as ill-fit sometimes. So analysis is required. Dispassionate, careful examination of facts and realities to correctly apply ethics. So ethics comes from human nature, human choice, and the application of reason. Now my other bullet point, why should theists accept non-religious based ethics on a society-wide basis? Well, if a person believes in pluralism and freedom of thought, it pretty much demands it. The freedom of religion, or to have religion, is exactly the same thing as the freedom from the dictates of other people's religions. I think that we agree, or I hope that we can agree, that we need an ideologically neutral public realm. I don't know what else to call it. Philosophers probably have a term for it, but to me it's an idea that there's a place, theoretical place we go to discuss things with no preconceptions about what's right or wrong. And that we have to respect that ideologically neutral public realm over any particular religion or philosophy. Otherwise, a society would have the ethical system of the most powerful elements of their society. And that happens around the world, doesn't it? So in this ideological neutral public realm, arguments concerning ethics must cite impact on the rights and welfare of other people. Religious arguments have no traction with those who don't share that religion. And I think that many religious people and non-religious people share values that actually emerge from our basic nature. And I think that, that religious people even have those basic intuitive values, and that they bring those values to their religion. And that's expressed in the selective way that people apply or live by their religion. They live by the pieces that feel right to them, and they disregard the pieces that don't. So we're all bringing ethics to the table that may be more part of our nature, part of our wiring, and that comes right through the religion to a point where I think that religious people and humanists like myself, there's a common denominator, and those principles, the basic ones that we can form a societal ethical system around, are those same human-centric principles that I embrace as a humanist. So that's my opening comment.
Thank you, Scott. And we're going to move along, and Harry, I really don't envy you the chair, because
what else is there to
what
be
else is there to
said?
say, right? I'm sure you have something to add.
I'll try. I jumped at the chance to be a part of the group here tonight, and I did it because this is a cross-section of community. And so far, and rightfully so, we've talked, not me, but to me, of religion, the absence of religion, ethics. We talked about what's right and wrong. We've talked about sources of direction. Who's to say what's right and wrong? And how do we determine what's right or wrong? And in the end, at the end of the day, we all are in this community, whether we want to be in the community or not. And the thing that really excited me about the opportunity to be a part of the group, this group, all of us, is that I honor the fact that the majority, if not all of you, maybe all of us, still honor the process of thinking critically. Critically. Not simply taking the lazy option of being told how to think and blindly following it. That's a sickness in our society now, in my humble perspective. And I honor each of you in taking your part in the community, knowing that each of us are a point of light. And if we choose to, that ripples out in concentric circles. Not to influence someone in our direction, but simply help find this natural compass and balance of what is right. It's not, in the end, it's quite simple. Although the whole realm of it is amazingly complex. Just not only in our own community, but in the state and in this nation, and in the US of A, and then you put all the other countries and cultures out there, and you have a real interesting proposition. We were each given 6 different bullets or areas of thought. And being the way I am from my perspective, 2 of those jumped out at me. One of them was, should we make a distinction between how the legal system creates a foundation for determining right and wrong versus how individuals, communities, and entire nations arrive at social norms that fall outside the purview of the law. Somebody mentioned earlier that one philosophy is to get a group in charge and have it make up the laws. I don't buy that. I think the proper order of things is to develop a way that the community can learn to talk and dialogue productively with respect, understanding and uncovering differences, honoring them as differences and not judging whether the differences are right or wrong, and through that process find common collective connections, things in common. And there is where the spark of what's right or wrong starts. And in our day and age, with technology the way it is, we are in a position to more quickly and more accurately summarize and find out what this great nation's 300+ millions of peoples in the main is collectively thinking. Or at least far beyond what we hear in sound bites from the moneyed, loudmouth few. That tends to direct so many of our people in our communities and in our country to lay back, not critically think, and just take it and run with it. So I salute you, and I'm glad to be a part of individuals in this room who have taken it on themselves not to do that. It's not the easiest thing to do. So I salute you for that. And the other, there was again coming back to community, how does a pluralistic society such as America find agreement about the legal codification of what is right or wrong? Again, I go back. Once that there's a determination made of what is workable and what resonates with our higher selves, to me that is our weather vane of where we look for what's right and wrong. We critically think it. And at some point it will either resonate with our hearts or it won't. And so we start with honoring ourselves. Okay? And even if in the face of adversity and disagreements, we have to be willing to change. If someone else's pattern of critical thinking is superior to ours, I'm ready to change. But I will make that process not blindly. I will think it through. And if somebody's got a better idea, I'm all for it. Even if I have to say, by golly, I rethought it and it's the right thing. So the process that we're doing tonight, and we're just preparing now to move this current out into the room, I can't wait to hear some of the perspectives that are out there, because we're all going to hear it. And that will give us additional light to come through the cracks, to bring us each a little more knowledge, convert that to wisdom, and carry that to those around us that we love in our circles of community. And lo and behold, over time, what's really right and makes sense will magically appear. Will magically appear. It doesn't have a whole lot to do with religion, except one of the core beauties of religion and positive ethics is that there is an inherent wish of most human beings to reach for something greater, something better. So that's my opening remark.
Excellent.
We'll see what happens from here.
I don't know about you, but I feel like my mind is full already.
It was full before. That's wonderful.
Like a seventh inning stretch.
Quick poll, do we need to turn the heater up? Is everything okay? Cold?
Getting a little chilly back here.
Just crank the thermostat up a little bit. I will try to shout.
Well, I have a couple questions as I was listening to the four of you to hopefully spark a little bit of conversation between the group up here before we move out to the audience. I've been most interested, we're talking about morality for individuals and all the way up to the level of cultures and societies. And I'm wondering, does it matter? Does it matter if my sense of my moral values are different than yours? Because if there's anything I can't tolerate, it's intolerance. Thank you for that. But isn't really the problem we run into is when we try to enforce morality. That's what I'm mostly concerned about. And when we talk about making law, and where does that law come from? And if it comes from God, then who's the voice of God? Or who's then the authority speaking for God? And Chris, as you were talking about at the very beginning of those levels, and the very base being looking for authority for the answer, right? So when we talk about the enforcement of morality, isn't that really what we have to agree on, is how that's done, more so than what our morals are? I mean, we have to our morals, what we agree to begin with what our morals are, but individually we have to get together. How are we going to enforce them? Do we need to?
Just open to the panel.
Yeah, let's just chat. Jump in.
I will jump in and quickly expanding community from the U.S. to the planet itself.
You might need to speak up a little bit. Can you
Okay,
hear me?
I'll over the fan.
Yeah, try to speak up.
We have enough issues to take care of in America. Not to be trying to change a lot of what goes on in other cultures, because that magical ingredient that is now coming through the internet and through this ability to cough and be heard around the world and immediately, that is bringing some of what we take an active part in, spending billions to change cultures, but we haven't healed our own. So I think when we think of enforcing or moving forward, solidifying what's right and wrong and ethical things, we should keep it at home.
I'm having a thought about the degree to which we have to impose things on each other as a society to function and be successful. And this gets into the sustainability pitch, I guess, because we have 7 billion people in the world now. 7 billion people in the world now, and increasing, expected to level off at around 10 billion. And I think that if I were alive at the time of Pa Ingalls or any number of hundreds of years before that, I'd be a libertarian. I mean, I don't like being messed with. I don't like being told what to do. I don't need systems to support me. I would rather be independent. But in a world of 7 billion people, all our rights and expectations overlap, and we have a lot of impact on each other that we never did. Viscerally, we still feel we want to be all by ourselves and left alone, but that's not the reality anymore. There's a lot of collective decision-making that has to happen for us to continue to thrive as a species. Therefore, I think we have to accept, this sounds awful, I don't even like it myself to hear it, but we have to accept sort of some more rules and enforcement so that we can thread the needle, so to speak, so that we can do the collective decision-making we have to do. And, pig farms next to fancy neighborhoods, In Pa Ingalls' day, you didn't have those kind of problems. And obviously they get bigger and more serious. Fracking and pipelines and economic issues and
resources in short supply. So ethics becomes more challenging, will probably involve more rules and enforcement, and requires much, much more analysis to sort out than it might have in the old days.
I guess my thought when you asked that question, Kim, was that all laws or legislation are the enforcement of someone's perspective about morality. It's always going to show that someone thinks about right or wrong. In America, of course, we do a lot with voting, though sometimes the elected officials, fewer people vote than others. But anytime something is passed, it's reflecting something about what some group of people believe is a good way to live versus a bad way to live. I've heard it broken down into 3 categories: that rules that the government makes that define our society are of 3 kinds. They'll prohibit some things, they'll permit some things, and then they will promote some things. So anytime you're going to prohibit something or promote something, it means you're taking a stance about whether or not you think that thing is good for society or it is bad for society. So I don't think we can get around just kind of a plain fact that those kind of legal structures and boundaries and laws reflect the way someone or some group of people thinks we ought to live. I think when it comes to questions of whether or not the motivation is religious or non-religious, we do have the privilege of living in a country where all ideas can be brought to the table and all arguments made. Scott, you mentioned something about needing this ideologically neutral public realm. And I'm not sure it's possible. I think everyone brings an ideology to it. But I think I like your idea that we live in a nation where we bring our arguments to the table and we try to make our best presentation of why we believe a particular thing is better for our society or not. And democracies are messy, but they allow for that conversation to take place.
I think that ideologically neutral place, maybe that's the wrong way to say it. I think people you will bring your ideology to it. But the point is that no ideologies are excluded from it. If anything is, no one has the right to preemptively reject anything. You're always allowed to come to that square and explore.
So maybe it's an ideologically inclusive public realm.
Well, I guess I'm not sure what to think about some of these things, but one question you might ask is why should our approach be to enforce morality as opposed to, say, teaching it? One thing that's interesting about those 6, I'm not an expert on ACORD, but when he talks about the 6 stages of moral reasoning, you might think, well, what is it that causes people to go from one stage to another? You might think it's just natural maturation process or something like that, or socialization, something like that. But from what I've read, he thinks that what causes you to move up to different stages is encountering people who disagree with you and discussing it with them, or in the absence of that, doing some role playing, trying to understand what it's like from another person's perspective. And that turns out to be very powerful. So I wonder, what if we had a society where we made an effort to do that, and not just during one semester when they take a philosophy class in college, but all through the education process. Maybe this idea of threatening people, saying you're going to be punished if you don't do this, isn't the right approach. Maybe there's a different approach that doesn't require that. An approach where people understand that what they do has an impact on other people and understand what it would be like to be in that person's position. And maybe that would change people for the better.
I think Scott said something very interesting when he said that he believes that people bring their moral values and ethics to their religion instead of the other way around. And that kind of stuck out to me because we know that we've talked in the past, 90% of Catholics use birth control, right? Or they, kind of pick and choose. We all do pick and choose, regardless of what the religious dictate is, if you will. Even if we say that we're, following that particular faith, and there are how many Protestant denominations that, as you said, maybe argue over one thing and move on, and now we're a separate group, a separate sect. So is that because, again, we're picking and choosing our religion because of the values we already hold? It sounds like we are, or most people do. So the original question tonight was, is religion necessary for ethics? So you just answered it in one sense, that which is the chicken and the egg question, right? I left you speechless.
I think that was a comment than a question.
Well, just add on to it.
I think if you have a sufficiently vague story, or a story that contains multiple stories within it that seem to be at odds with each other, it's inevitable that you have to pick and choose. I don't see that as a criticism. I think you have to do it. It's literally impossible to say, I believe everything literally in the Bible. I don't think that's a tenable position, because the biblical authors don't agree with each other about a lot of things. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that people come to these religious texts with something in mind, and they use that as a basis by which to select certain. I don't think that's always what's going on in those cases. I think there are, as with any field, in biblical scholarship, there are genuine, legitimate, rational disagreements. And on the basis of those, you can come to different conclusions. So I don't think it's necessarily illegitimate that people end up disagreeing about these things. And I don't think it's necessarily motivated by something sort of selfish or sinister.
I think we all established at the beginning, everybody on the panel, that we agree that people arrive at solid ethical conclusions outside of religious traditions. Everybody here?
Yes.
Okay.
People arrive at that, whether
In the
it's
back, they can.
whether it's through what some have called natural law, whether it's through rationality. There are clearly ways to arrive at good, solid perspectives on morality without needing to read the Bible, for example. I think what religion brings to the discussion of ethics is it posits that there's an objective, transcendent base or foundation that rises above all cultures and all people, and allows you to have a standard by which you can measure whether or not human progress is good versus bad, whether or not civilizations are heading in the right direction or the wrong direction, as well as individuals. Now, I recognize what Chris pointed out earlier, there's many competing religious traditions in the world. But in a broad sense, I don't think our disagreements are over whether or not we can discern particular ethical things. I think our questions probably go to a deeper level, and that is, at what point do things get an ought attached to them? And is there a way in which we can adjudicate between very sincere competing voices that all make a claim either from rationality or from religion or from experience? They make claims about what's ethically good, and yet at times real strongly disagree. Is there something by which we can view all those competing things and find a way to see what rises to the surface? I think that's where, at least on the stage, and I don't know, perhaps even in the audience.
Well, let's go
is
there.
where we
It's a little
find
after 8,
disagreement.
so let's do that. Let's go there and see if we have any really. Oh, we've already got people who want to speak. Let's go.
Well, I just, when you just discussed,
If you would make sure to try to speak up, so
Okay.
everyone can hear.
so I just find it hard to distinguish in a way between when you talk about the legalistic, which you said the people with the power make the rules. Whoa,
Sign
that's
for
special
that.
connections. When you said people in power make the rules, that's kind of legalistic. Am I interpreting what you said
yeah,
right?
the legal realism.
The regal,
Yeah.
I can hardly distinguish that from religion. Because if you look at religion from an anthropological perspective, before there were police forces, there were religions, where you were punished for certain behaviors or threatened with punishment after death. So, to me, those two seem to have very much in common. Would that be true? And even we just elected a new pope for that religion. So you have, again, the people in power making the rules. So the transcendent part is that, I guess the question would be, is that transcendent part sort of an illusion, you know, that we originally used to establish a culture that makes sense and we all could survive in, and that grew into government? Or how do you deal with that question?
Okay, I'll give you my opinion on it. I'm guessing you'll hear different opinions up here. When we talk about legal realism or legal positivism, one of the claims is that there is no broader sense of an objective way to understand ethics. So what will happen is a culture, a society, a country will simply have to agree upon what they want to enforce as an ethical way to live. So they're not referencing the idea that there's something underlying it that they're revealing. They're not revealing morality, they're creating morality. So the claim, and I'll speak for Christianity, the claim of Christianity would be that the more I understand morality, the more I'm revealing it rather than creating it. That I'm discovering an objective standard that underlies reality in a way that I might not have seen clearly before. In response to the second thing, I don't experience the moral boundaries of Christianity as something that I do out of fear. But it's interesting as I listen to Chris talk about
What's the name of that? They were told them to save some laws.
that. As he was talking about that, you know, it's interesting. I would say that from the time I was a child until the time that I'm not a kid anymore, I'm getting younger. I don't associate my adherence to the moral philosophy of Christianity as something I do out of fear. I do it out of the idea that this is for the flourishing of the world. I love how Scott talks a lot about he has this desire to see people flourish. And that's how I understand the morality of Christianity. It's a structure in which we flourish. And not just I as an individual, but everyone.
And that's sort of what I'm saying. It almost is what you said, why does it matter? If the religion did the same thing the laws do, in
Well, I
my
think
opinion.
for me, the difference is, and the question that I was asking is, if religion is the one side, who gets to determine, who gets to carry the voice of God, so to speak, right? Because we aren't all hearing the voice of God, but somebody's in charge, like you said, the Pope, whoever, along that hierarchy. And I think in a more modern view, when we create law, at least here in this country, we look at it more that we collectively agree upon something. And so I think that there is a difference between those two, if that's what you're asking. But the enforcement would be the same then, right? Once it's agreed upon, now we have to
Or you
decide
could
how
argue
to
it's
enforce
agreed
it,
upon
or
by
should
the-
we enforce it at all?
Or it's agreed upon by the people with money and power. Not
First off, people have to bring it forward.
Right. Ideally.
We had enough, did you,
No, let's go to
you had a question
Yeah, my question is mostly
or a comment?
for Scott. So obviously as the atheist humanist, you would definitely agree to a great extent that religion is not necessary for ethics. Would you agree that religion is
I couldn't hear you. Could you speak a little slower and to the audience too?
Yeah, okay. So as an atheist, you agree that religion is not necessary for ethics. Would you agree that religion is or has been detrimental to the development of ethics?
I don't know about to generalize. I mean, as I said, a lot of people bring their ethics to their religion, and then their ethics end up being expressed through them, which also embodies religion. So I see loving things done by Christian people and by people of other religions, but since I'm mostly surrounded with Christians, most of the loving things I see done are in fact by Christians, and they believe it's out of a loving Christian spirit. I think I'm more likely to attribute it to their loving nature. They would happen not to be Christians, I think they would probably also feel and behave that way. So certainly, some things come out of our nature and come right through our religion to the surface and are expressed. There's certainly been horrendous things done because of incorrect beliefs that are part of religion. And I mean, it almost becomes stereotypical or trite to start talking about crusades and religious wars and such, but those things happen. Am I in a position to say the atrocities and the harm done are greater than the good done by people that they believe they're doing through their religion? I don't know if I'm in a position to judge that industry. I have another value in addition to my human-centric ethics is just the straight-out value of truth. I value it. So I would rather have an ethics that's not based on what I regard to be false belief or mythology. I want an ethics that's human-centric, that's based on how my actions impact others and whether we build a cool thing here in society. Do we build a cool society where people have an opportunity to self-actualize and do interesting, fun things and be free from pain? I want to build that kind of society. But I want to do that with a clear head, and I want to revel in nature the way it really is. So I just have a value of not, I don't want to subscribe to a myth. And I kind of wish that for everybody. So in that way, I guess I'm a little bit evangelical as an atheist, but it's because of the goodness in my heart.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think there are a lot of things that we atheists can learn from religious folks. So there's a lot of things that they're doing right that we could employ in maybe in a parallel way. So, I mean, they get together every week and they have these lectures trying to teach them how to be a better person and to live better. That's a good thing. They employ certain educational techniques like repetition. How many times a day do you talk about? You remind yourself, this is what I'm living for. These are my values. You call it prayer. There's a lot of structure to the religious life in terms of religious calendar. You can't go through a year without being reminded that people sacrifice. It's important. There's kinesthetic learning through rituals, right? You wash yourself as a symbol of starting over. You kneel as a symbol of humility. It's a good lesson to remind yourself of. There's art, right? Art can inspire people to do great things and to remind you of what things you should avoid. So there's a lot of things in religion that I think should be dismissed just because of some other aspects of it that might rub you the wrong way or seem false or seem not to be based on any good evidence. A lot of good lessons to be learned.
My thoughts went somewhere else with the question, and that is more from psychology, and I'm not a psychologist, but just the thought that there's a part of our brains, I think, the human mind, where religion dwells, if you will, that propensity to believe without evidence, on faith, that I think can be truly, can make us vulnerable. And we've seen that with cult behavior and certain people take advantage of it in leading people to do evil things, or things to make them believe either that God said we should do this and that kind of thing. And we could list all kinds of instances in history, like what was that called?
Holocaust.
But I mean, just even smaller instances with cult behavior where people have been murdered or whatever, and they felt it was righteous. So that might touch on your question a little bit too, and I think that delves into the psychology part. And I'm going to go to your question, but I think you want to add to it.
Just really quickly, I would propose that there's a commonality between all of this. And Scott and I have had conversations on this. I believe that all religions, or the lack of religions, have a commonality where they meet. And that commonality has nothing to do with supernatural, because there's no religion that's ever been perfect. There will never be any human being that will ever be perfect. But they all meet at a place where there is no definition. I call it a place of love. It doesn't make any difference whether you're an atheist or a Wiccan or whatever. There's a place where hearts can meet, and a lot of the stuff is set aside because all human beings, for the most part, are inherently good. I truly believe that. If I didn't, I would be really frightened. Okay? But I'm not. So, food for thought.
I'd like to add on to Rory's answer to this question if I can. Did I remember your name?
Yeah.
Excellent. And I want to add on to it because as an atheist, I'm often asked, you know, why don't you just let people have their faith? And sometimes that causes me some pause. But you've asked the question is, does faith sometimes do harm as well as do good through it? And there are some subtler, closer to home ways that I think it's problematic. I mean, harm is a strong word. But one of those ways is that sometimes some people, the way that they hold their faith to the particular things they believe, might cause them to not take responsibility as a human for our actual condition, the 7 billion people in the world and all the things that we have to deal with. If the fate of the world is in God's hands, if the future's in God's hands, then it's not my responsibility, right? That, I think, can be a serious harm to us in this day and age. And then another thing that bothers me from time to time is when I see people brought up in religion, which I think, in my mind, I'm sorry to be blunt with people who are believers, but it's a system based on faith is not one that's based on inquiry and is not likely to lead the person to the truth. So when I see kids indoctrinated, little kids in their cute little Sunday clothes being told miraculous stories, fantastical stories about, you know, baby Jesus and virgin birth and rising again and parting seas and all of these things, Noah's Ark and swallowed by a whale and all these things, and the implication there is that they are associated, they're made to associate their ability to believe these fairy tale-like stories with goodness. And I don't like that conflict. I want people to be free to be good and then to also dispassionately acquire and discover the universe. So I don't like that very much. So those are a couple of other ways that I think religion is a problem. You know, I also live in a society that's 80% religious people, and I love many of them dearly, and I try to be careful not to offend them, but that's the world that I see it.
Fred, did you? Then we'll get to that.
I see much of what's going on here is a search for a universal truth, universal ethics that you can apply to society across the board, and especially when that comes to religion and, if you don't mind, I use the word dogma and that encompassing. And I see that as being largely, I won't say to what degree, but I'll say it's largely delusional and self-righteous. Because for each individual, he has a set of experiences that said, this is how I define this moral judgment, this value, this ethic. And it's based on my experiences, which are different than the guy standing next to me. And when you start doing that, you say, my ethic is going to be universal, and I'm going to apply that to laws. And when you start doing that, you have a minority that suffers from it.
Then you're denying that neutral, ideologically neutral public realm.
Right, but when you have that minority suffering, that diminishes and devalues the ethic right away. And for that individual, for each individual in that minority, the value in that ethic has no meaning whatsoever because he's committed a law, he's broken a law to feed his family, he's done something wrong according to society, but prisons are full of people that say, I committed that crime and I was justified in doing it because of this and this and this reason. And you have a lot of problems evolving out of that because you have an element of society, the bourgeois, the 1%, the moral majority, the middle class, defining what is right and wrong, and you have a minority suffering for it. So I'm saying that you're reaching for a universal ethic is wrong.
If I could respond to that as the Christian on the panel. It's interesting as you talk about the idea that there's a specific vocal group that wants their ethic to become a universal norm. I would suggest that pretty much everybody would like that. That whenever you see a debate in the public square over a particular issue, every group that is present is there because they believe that their perspective is a good enough one that it ought to be embraced by others, or perhaps even enforced on others depending what it is. And I'm not thinking of a particular topic, it's just that that's part of the clash of the legal system or of laws that societies have, is that you have different people who all feel very strongly that the world would be a better place, that humanity would flourish if a particular thing were in place. For some people it's a religious base, for some people it's not. But whoever wins the discussion is going to be in a position where their group's perspective is the one that now everyone else has to participate in. So I think that singling out a particular kind of group doesn't do justice to the clash that's taking place as everyone brings their perspective to the table. But I think the question, though, of is there a universal truth or right or wrong, actually does bring us back to maybe a deeper question, and that is, are we all in agreement about what a right and wrong is, or what good and evil is? I'm thinking in particular of, I know Richard Dawkins has gone on record of saying that he just thinks the universe is a place in which there is no right or wrong, or no good or evil. I was reading some notes from a presentation Daniel Dennett did recently, where he said, the more we learn about what it means to be human, the more we realize that there is no such thing as morals. And in fact, he kind of cautioned the people at the conference. He said, this isn't the kind of thing we want to tell the general population, because civilizations rely on the belief that there is morality, and if people would realize there's not, we'd be in trouble. And so I think there's a deeper question that comes back, and that is, if there's not such a thing as right and wrong or good or evil, then it seems to me that we would have a hard time discussing what is moral behavior, or how do we become better societies? How do we move from not being good to better if there's not language in place to discuss it? But as you hear us talk, obviously we all agree that there's a sense in which we can be better, and we are moving from one place we don't want to be to another place. And I think if you would poll those of us here on the stage, we'd probably agree about 90% of things about how to live a good moral, ethical life. I wonder, though, what to do when language isn't in place by which to discuss what that journey looks like.
Well, I agree a lot with what you're saying, but I think the danger is when you're approaching a definition of a universal rule or truth, then you're saying that then you're being kind of self-righteous, saying this is good for everybody, and it may not be.
I think we're trying to ask the question, is it possible? Is there one then that we should approach?
There is not. The diversity of human beings.
Just a quick comment. I think a great deal of the negative energy that flies around could be eliminated if people could, rather than saying, I feel my way is best, so I'm going to force you through legislation to go my way, is to live and let live. Now, this wouldn't work in every case, but a lot of time and effort and negative emotion in this country is spent not understanding how to disagree and finding right and wrong within it. If you don't like a certain thing, then follow your path. Don't try to make me follow yours. That doesn't work in every sense, but we've lost the ability as a culture in many cases to negotiate, to respect, to accept rights of others. We simply have to win.
Oh, we got lots of hands now. You had a hand up early.
Yeah.
Earlier.
So I'm going to try to throw a little bit of a wrench into things, and I do have my question is sort of for everyone on the panel, and there's a little setup required, but I do promise there's a question at the end of it. We posted an article on the Etcetera page this week. There's a Dutch scientist, and I'm just referring to some notes on my phone, Frans de Waal, who has a book out this week in which he posits, he's studied primates for decades, and his theory is that every species, from humans all the way down to insects, are actually hardwired for morality. And he says that he believes that there's a biological imperative towards compassion and empathy, and he's seen this in primates, and he's seen it in other animals he studied where, for example, a monkey that's has a cognitive disorder is given special treatment by the tribe when it does something that a monkey is normally not allowed to do, like threatens an alpha. So his thing is that, one, when we see people behaving immorally, we should have compassion for them. For example, if you look at like the Sandy Hook killer or someone who acts out in a violent way, they're actually acting in a self-destructive way, because if you don't have a society that's healthy and stable, it's not an environment in which an individual can flourish. So he says, one, we should be compassionate for people who act immorally because they're acting in a self-destructive way. And two, he says that religion is a construct that humans have invented to help enforce this biological imperative towards morality. That it's good for society when we act in a moral way because it stabilizes society. So he thinks religion is a way in which we help enforce that behavior. And I think he just has an interesting quote here, but he says, "I'm wary of any person whose belief system is the only thing standing between them and repulsive behavior. Why not assume that our humanity, including the self-control needed for a livable society, is built into us? Does anyone truly believe that our ancestors lacked social norms before they had religion? Humans must have been worried about the functioning of their community well before current religions arose, which occurred only a couple of millennia ago. Biologists are unimpressed by that kind of time scale." So I guess my question for each of you on the panel is, if further scientific testing were to be done and it were to become evident that we're some way hardwired for morality, rather than the kind of traditional Christian idea of a fallen man whose proclivity is towards sin or evil, how would that impact your worldview? And two, how would that impact the way we talk about morality?
Well, I'd love to jump on that. I like to read a guy's book. I already believe in this theory before you even brought it up. We are all part of the universal web of life. And there's much, it's my understanding that the DNA spirals, there's so little difference between a dinosaur and our own DNA, which is one supportive theory here. And if you watch and love and let your higher self communicate with animals, it's a no-brainer. They have a morality. They have a control. We have to take our higher, quote-unquote, human definitions out of it. Animals are so far ahead of us because they live in the present moment, number one. And they love unconditionally, number two. And it's a spectacular concept. I love it. Thank you for bringing it up.
It sounds like the author reflected a bit of what I described in my opening remarks, that that the foundation of our ethics is in our biological wiring. It is a product of natural selection and evolution. It sounds to me like he overstates it a bit, like we're hardwired for ethical behavior all the way down to insects. That's a bit extreme for me. In addition to the propensity or the capability to be ethical and compassionate, we also have some more unseemly characteristics that are preserved by evolution in our character. They can coexist, and often they coexist in sort of a tension with one another, but are both preserved down in evolutionary history. So the tendency to be selfish, the compulsion to raid your neighbor for his food cache, that's there as well, but and both have their uses to an organism in an evolutionary sense. So both extremes of our nature are preserved in evolution. Even sometimes the enforcer, the role of the enforcer, the emotion of sort of indignation and hostility when somebody doesn't conform, there's a role for that, because when people stray from the rules that keep society functional and more successful, if there's an element of society that's a little bit wired to bark or snap at that organism, then then you're maintaining the condition that evolution can act on. So there are many different traits in our nature. As a matter of fact, all the traits that we have are a result of a biological process of natural selection. And they can exist, all coexist in various tensions, you know, in proportions that evolution has given us.
Okay, briefly, I'll just say, I think the conclusions that draws are I think they're both too broad and too narrow. Part of the reasons that Scott has already said. I mean, to be moral, you have to be an agent. You have to be capable of having intentions, for example. I don't think ants have intentions. Right? So ants aren't the sort of thing that can be held morally responsible for their actions. I mean, it strikes me as an attempt to make some scientific research sound really profound and important. Right? So I wouldn't have put it that way if I were him. Put it that way. But I think it's also, in a way, too narrow because humans are also very tribal. You know, we're okay with protecting our own, but those other people, they gotta die, you know? So I guess it's both too broad and too narrow in this sense. We're not necessarily oriented yet toward protection of our own species as a whole. Maybe some of us more so than others, but and I would also add that I think even though animals, at least certain animals, aren't capable of moral agency, we still have moral responsibilities towards them because they are capable of suffering, and suffering is a bad thing no matter who or what has it.
Okay, so a couple quick thoughts. I agree with what both Scott and Chris said, that it seems like the author's not looking at the downside of certain behaviors we see in animals. You know, lions are hardwired to chase down the weakest in the herd and kill it. If that's a biological imperative, we're in trouble. I wonder though, some of the thoughts came to mind. One was, the argument seems to be that if we are hardwired to be religious, it follows that religion is illusory, or it's just a tool for us, something we made up. But I think you'd probably also argue we're hardwired to be rational. But I don't think you would claim that rationality is something we've made up. You would probably claim that we're hardwired to be rational so that we can appreciate rationality. I think then you could just as well make the argument, if we're hardwired to be religious, it's so that we can appreciate religion. And my only other thought would be, let's say religion, or let's say we do have a biological imperative. I'm not sure we would follow then that it means religion is independent. I think as a Christian I could argue that perhaps God was part of the process of that biological hardwiring, and religion was the thing that He gave us to help us adjudicate between the bad things that these guys mentioned and the good things that the article mentions. So it doesn't feel to me like what the author is claiming is a defeater for a religious or Christian perspective.
Well, and to Scott and Chris's point, I mean, that article is on the Facebook page if anyone wants to look at it. I don't want to misstate the author's, that was my own paraphrasing, but I think kind of the second part of my question I was getting at is I think he's saying what we consider to be morality. I don't think he's suggesting an ant is thinking in moral terms, but it acts sometimes in an empathetic way that we don't traditionally expect animals to act because it's for the good of the community that it's a part of.
So describe certain behavior as if empathetic, but again, do you think ants have feelings like that?
Maybe
They might.
They might, but I think
we can't say
totally
definitely
implausible.
that they don't. Only that we think they do.
Yep. It could be that
Do
rocks
you
have
have
feelings
feelings?
too. We don't know. But I think it's highly plausible.
I was interested in the last question that you asked, which was, does that change our conversation about morality? I don't know if anybody really addressed that. And for me, I think that that's like asking the same question of, you know, where is God or where does God dwell, right? And by the same answer, is it up here, is it in here, or is it in here? You know, and I think it's the same when we talk about morality or we talk about whether there is or isn't a God, which is kind of always part of the same conversation. So, no, I don't have an answer, I just...
Well, we just always seem to talk about morality as though it were a choice, and I guess I'm asking if there were some biological imperative towards it, does that sort of diminish the choice aspect of morality?
George Pereboom has written a book about why we can still be moral and apply moral categories to actions, even if it turns out that determinism is true, so that nobody ever actually chooses to do something in the sense of being able to have done anything other than what they did. So I don't think it follows, even if it turns out that something like determinism is true, that morality is off the table.
Questions?
Albert Einstein offered some really interesting insights on this very topic, and I've done my best to try to recall the quote to the best of my ability. It went along the lines of this: ethical behavior should be based on sympathy, education, and social ties. No religious basis is necessary. Man would indeed be in a poor way if he lived his life by seeking rewards, fear of punishment, and blind faith. I think man would be better served by striving after rational knowledge. So what I find intriguing about that statement is that in all of that, it seems to be searching for the authenticity in ethical behavior. In other words, it's inauthentic to do the right thing in order to get a reward or avoid punishment, as opposed to doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do, right? So I'm really curious, and I suspect, Scott, that you might find some agreement with what Albert Einstein is saying here. But again, the employment of our rational knowledge. Earlier, Scott, you had mentioned how people go to religion with some intuitive knowledge of ethics. And I guess what concerns me is the idea that religious dogma or doctrine can usurp that intuitive knowledge to the extent that we become ignorant of it. And so now we're no longer using that intuitive knowledge or using rational knowledge, as Einstein suggests, but instead going off of what the doctrine says in order to get that reward or avoid that punishment.
I'll take that as a comment, not a question.
Were you phrasing something as a question there, Mela, that you're wanting us to?
Yeah, what's the-
If you find a question in any of that, you're welcome to respond.
I do enjoy Einstein's comments on ethics. I mean, he was a person who, well, he was a signer of the original Humanist manifesto, so he was that, but he was very resistant to being called an atheist. Yet he, when questioned about ethics, he's very emphatic that ethics is a human affair.
Two comments. I think Einstein also said in 1934 that religion without science is blind, and science without religion is lame. So he had his own personal meaning of those two concepts. I just point that out. Your comment about doing things that are good because you were told they're good, as opposed to doing things that you know are good, and when you do them, you just feel good. You don't need a God to tell you that it feels good. You know in your higher self and heart that it is good. I bring that into the conversation because all of us reach out to sources greater than ourselves. God is just one way to do it. Problem with the word God is it's so often construed just to be one certain type of God. I personally like to use divine spirit. Divine spirit embraces it all, in all forms. Because if anyone subscribes that there may be this unique, unified realm of love and a divineness, pick a name that doesn't automatically label it one way or another according to one religion's position. Your hands out to chew on.
We have just a few minutes left, so let's take the last question. Keith.
Anthony, you started to talk about the ought, and it seems like the positions that are different here is where the ought, how we arrive at the ought. And what I'm hearing from you is it's a top-down ought, and from what I'm hearing from Scott is it's a bottom-up ought, how we arrive at it. meaning from individuals and from people and from discussion.
Sure.
That's what I mean by bottom up. Yours is a top down. You seem to be alluding, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, to a larger than us thing that the ought comes from. And so it seems like that's where I'm seeing the difference here. And I think that's going to be a very difficult thing to really reconcile. I think that I'd say, is it more constructive that you arrive at the ought through discussion, disagreement, where the individuals are talking, than, because I don't know where that universal is going to come from. I don't know who's deciding that. So I'm feeling a little more comfortable when there's more voices involved in how you arrive at the ought. And I know you wanted to talk about that, and I didn't hear you say much more about it.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because I want to make 2 points. One is, I think there's a distinction to be made between how we arrive at public policy versus what I as an individual believe in terms of ethics that I need to adhere to. So I'm not a fan of theocracy. So I make a distinction. I think when you have a public policy discussion about how you get a group of people, like in America, to agree upon common codes of conduct as seen in the law, you're bringing a lot of voices to the table, and I'll go back to the idea of the Tao. There are universal things that, in general, people embrace as understanding this is necessary to have a society that works. So I make sure I make a distinction between the oughtness that I feel as a Christian versus what we agree to do as a society. Does that distinction make sense?
Sure.
Okay. Okay, now I lost track of the second point. Go ahead, Scott. What?
Oh, you thought, yeah.
The Tao, is that a D, or as in dog, or T?
T-A-O.
The Oriental Universal.
Someone else had a question.
Yeah, there's
Oh,
another question.
okay, remember what it was. Can I say
Okay,
real
hold
quick?
to the whole time.
Let's work with the top-down versus bottom-up. I think that's one reason that it is very important in the Christian tradition that morality and, well, a lot of things are discussed in community, because it's hard enough for communities to get things right sometimes. It's even harder for just individuals all alone. I'll be the first to acknowledge that the church historically has gotten things wrong, because even community is not always a guarantee that you can arrive at a good conclusion. That's why I think a lot of voices are important to help us understand. Mellow's quote from Einstein, I would just paraphrase a little bit of what Einstein said. It seemed like he was making a conflict between intuition and rationality and belief. I would say that all three of those work together actually to help us discern what's true. I see them as friends, not foes, in the process of trying to make sure, at least for myself, that I'm doing my best to clearly understand what the things are that I believe I ought to do. That's cool.
I come here whenever I can because I like and I need to learn things, learn from new ideas, learn to think. And one of the things that I heard tonight that resonated a lot was what you said about learning. So we were discussing about a universal idea of moral, what's good, what's not. You're talking about things are, global, and what I keep on thinking is that I was wired to be nice, but I have to learn to be nice. It's an everyday practice. It's a street philosophy, So my question is, what can be done? And I know we have philosophy teachers here.
We didn't say they were good teachers.
But they're at least trying, So in my mind, if it's a government who is going to reinforce at what level, everything's a learning process. So the question is, can this be worked, through schools, just just learning to think, learning to reason, learning
Yes.
to be good
Yes.
to ourselves and to others. So I think that is more attainable, than trying to think that there will be a universal morality. There's no such thing.
Yes.
So please, philosophy teachers, what's your experience? What can be done, if at all?
I guess I lament the idea that we don't teach critical thinking or ethics until people get to college. I think it's a huge mistake. It's a huge mistake. I often feel that it's too late by the time students get to me. They're already so ingrained in a certain way of thinking that you can't influence them anymore. So we need to start sooner. And taking a lesson from Kohlberg again, we need to introduce people to new ideas, to ideas that challenge them, ideas, bring in. So, growing up as a Christian, I would often hear about other Christian denominations or other religions, and I would learn about them in this way. This is the religion that gets that wrong. This is the religion that gets that wrong. That's not fair. That's not fair to those people. We should bring in representatives of those religions and have them explain, here's what I think and why, and ask me anything. And that's how we would learn to get along better. We would increase our empathy, and you can't learn without being challenged. You just can't. I mean, you can memorize things, but that's not the same as becoming a better thinker, becoming more educated.
I think that is a wonderful note to end on, because we're already at 9 o'clock.